Well, welcome everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Clint Work. I'm Fellow and Director of Academic Affairs here at KEI, and we are very pleased to host today's book launch event for a book titled South Korea's Wild Ride, The Big Shifts in Foreign Policy from 2013 to 2022. And I've been informed there are several books in the house for those interested to purchase after our event. Also, as you may have seen, for those who are here in person, we have lunch out in the adjoining room, so please feel free to grab that and even eat it while we have our event. I'm just going to provide short introductions now. We have longer bios for our authors and speakers on our website. To my immediate left, Dr. Gil Rozman is the Emeritus Musgrave Professor of Sociology and the Editor-in-Chief of the Asan Forum, which is a bi-monthly online journal on international relations and the Indo-Pacific. He's also a long-standing peer review editor for KEI's publications, including continuing with our new flagship journal, Korea Policy. Next to Gil is Dr. Sumi Terry, who is the founder of Peninsula Strategies and previously served as the director of the Asia program in the Hyundai Motor Korea Foundation Center for Korean History and Public Policy at the Wilson Center, and served in various policy positions related to the Korean Peninsula and the region, and I think, as most know, speaks and writes widely on such issues. And next to Sue is Eun A Jo, who is a PhD candidate in the government department at Cornell University, and a 2023-24 Morgenthau Fellow at the International Security Center at the University of Notre Dame. I committed the faux pas of asking Eun A before the event where her dissertation stood. And I know it's close to completion, and I'm sure the springboard to a successful, promising academic career. So we're very pleased to have you all here today. And it's very likely, given my own innate interest, that I'd have read this book regardless of today's event. But that I get to moderate and be part of a discussion as a part of my work is really something I'm fortunate to be able to do. Just briefly, their book covers shifts, as the title indicates, in South Korea's foreign policy from 2013 to 2022 over the course of 3 presidential administrations, the presidencies of Park Geun-hye, Moon Jae-in, and the early years or year of the current president, Yoon Suk-yeol. And each of the authors writes 3 chapters, which are organized into 3 distinct time periods, which are situated around 2 key transitions, which they'll speak about. But the time periods are 2013 to 15, 2016 to 2019, and 2020 to 2022. And in each of these periods, the authors examine South Korea's foreign policy on different levels or through a different prism. In the case of Sumi, she looks at the ROK US-North Korea triangle. Gil looks at great power relations and their impact on South Korea. And Eun A looks at divergent interpretations of foreign policy imperatives between conservative and progressive camps within South Korea through analysis of key newspapers in the country. So I found their multi-level analysis and process tracing analysis really quite helpful in thinking back over this last really tumultuous decade for South Korea, and also as a great way to think about where we may be headed. And so I asked, maybe to start things off, our authors to give 2 minutes or so on what they think sets this book apart from other accounts of South Korea's foreign policy. So without further ado, I'll turn right to my left. Gil.
Thank you, Clint. I would say there are 4 things that make this distinctive. One is the breadth. Clint has already talked about the 3 prisms we use to examine the last decade. And I think that's pretty comprehensive, trying to think of what does South Korea's policy mean for the geopolitics of Northeast Asia and for the challenges we faced, also domestic politics. And so I think the breadth is pretty special. Another is the timeliness. This really captures a decade when so much was changing, when it's really in between the post-Cold War and the new Cold War, and so much mattered, and South Korea was on the front lines of it all. It was the swing country, the country that China wanted to turn, that the U.S.-Chinese competition. All the great powers were really struggling over what that meant, and South Korea in particular was trying to use this opportunity to change the nature of the region. And so I think that the timeliness is special. The sources are also unusual. It's really immersed in month by month coverage of what South Koreans were thinking, the process of transformation, the point of view. And in this sense, it's a second of a 4-book plan. The book on Putin's turn to the East in the Xi Jinping era had a book launch in October. The book on Japan's momentous decade comes out in May, and the book on China we're still working on, we hope to finish next summer. And so each will cover the decade from the sources in the region, the country reports that month by month analyze what's going on there. And finally, I would say what makes this unusual is the centrality of what South Korea was trying to accomplish. It was trying to transform the region. It was trying to steer the great powers toward a new regional architecture, to find a balance between the United States and China, to transform through outreach to North Korea. And because of these really significant issues, analyzing them gives us a perspective not just on South Korea, but on the transformation of the Indo-Pacific region. So I'll stop with that.
So Gil just summarized it so beautifully. I don't have much to say, but I do think, because I do read a lot of, most every book that comes out on South Korea, for respect out of, to my colleagues, I read all of them. And I do think this is pretty comprehensive and very in-depth, even for the experts who are following it, just to be able to just have take another look. And again, our focus is on the shifts, right? Because we trace the continuities and changes in the South Korean foreign policy landscape of this very eventful decade. And when South Korea does become very active and important force in the world. And this is why we called it a wild ride, right? South Korea's wild ride, because it really took the region into this wild ride as it tried to deter North Korea, as it tried to manage US-China relationship, and navigate through other challenges in the region. And it does, at least my sections, it's just so interesting when you just read, even though I knew what happened, but even as I'm reading it, South Korea, like the United States, is such a politically divided country, and its policies really shifted dramatically from president to president. So all the 3 presidents that we covered in the book, from Park Geun-hye to Moon Jae-in and now Yoon Suk-yeol, really left their distinct mark on Korea and the region. And again, I think what makes it our book special is that we don't really just kind of relay what happened in a chronological way necessarily. We do separate these chapters into these periods. These are transition periods when new directions are set, basically, to assess why certain decisions have been made the way they were made, what they all mean, and to really showcase the contrast between the decisions that were taken by the conservative leader of Park Geun-hye, then the progressive leader of Moon Jae-in, and then again the conservative leader Yoon. And I always just say, I think our book is also special in that, our 3 co-authors, like we 3 make it also a little bit special and different in that we bring different perspectives to this project, right? I'm a former US intel person turned policymaker turned academic and think tanker. But that's very different from Gil, obviously a professor of sociology at Princeton. And you have this big picture of Northeast Asia, and you deal with themes like modernization, national identities, and so on, regionalism, mutual perceptions, and a lot of strategic thinking. And obviously, Eun A also brings her experience doing work in political narratives, memory, and domestic politics, and all of this. So I think 3 of us sort of bringing these different perspectives also make the book a little bit different. And it's been a privilege to have worked with you guys and produce this book.
It's great. Thanks so much. And I echo everything that's already been said. I think beyond comprehensiveness, the book also provides a fairly balanced overview of this very eventful period in South Korean foreign policy. And I think it achieves that by situating specific events that occurred, like, President Park Geun-hye's visit to Beijing or the number of missile tests that we've seen, in broader bilateral, regional, and domestic dynamics. And we parsed out those differences over time. There's, I think, also a real purpose in dividing up this period in this way, not by the sort of presidencies that we've seen a lot, but by changes in South Korea's incumbent thinking and domestic mood surrounding these key relationships. This, for me, accomplishes two things. The first is that it avoids the more sort of caricaturistic portrayals of South Korean presidencies and foreign policy in particular. What the analysis does show is that South Korean administrations can and do respond to external and internal developments in fairly decisive ways. The second is that it helps clarify sources of constraints in each administration's foreign policy objectives and how they navigated those challenges. So it does well to highlight not just the structural environment, but the individual agencies of these administrations and what they did to place South Korea on the map. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. That was very comprehensive. Sue, you're right. It's really not just a chronology, right? It's or a listing of events. It situates those events in these different relationships around key themes, which are patterned across these periods. And so I really do. It's far more than just a primer, but it's a great resource if you want to look at any one of these given periods, either in each of your particular prisms, or all together. I know I'll be sort of returning to it myself to bone up on these key shifts. I wanted to ask, digging more into the content, each of you, if you could highlight three key takeaways across each of the three periods that your chapters analyze. So I guess going in the same order that we just went.
Okay, my goal was to try to understand the regional dynamics. So South Korea placed among four great powers, all trying to gain some strategic advantage in the region, or to fend off some strategic challenge. And the first takeaway I have is how fascinating the Park Geun-hye first 3 years were. She, despite being a conservative, she had very bold goals with her trust politique and her Eurasian outreach to the Russians and her honeymoon with Xi Jinping and her effort to keep the U.S. close, unlike the more progressive administrations. And so this was trying to maximize Seoul's place in a regional context. But she was whiplashed by the shifts in bilateral relations going on around her. And so the Sino-US relationship changed dramatically. The US-Japan relationship was transformed. The Sino-Russian relationship became much closer. The Russia-US relations deteriorated badly in 2014. And so all of these things had an impact on what she could accomplish. And she tried to become a kind of autonomous ally of the US, a trust-building suitor of China, a historical avenger of Japan, a Eurasian liaison. It was so moving in all these directions, and yet she could not corral the various powers. And by the end of 2015, this initiative really had come to an end. It was a dead end. And so long before she left office in disgrace, there had to be a change of course, and that's what we observe in period 2. So now I'll go to my takeaway from period 2, and that is that this was a kind of last gasp against all odds to achieve this transformation where South Korea could play the central role. And North Korea was to be the vehicle of this. So wishful thinking had really very little limit, but it turned out it was exposed to have very severe limits. And the US-North Korea gap was just too great, as we will hear in a moment. The China-US gap was widening precipitously. the U.S.-Japan bonding was tightening, making South Korea look like the odd country out. And at the end, there's a kind of Hail Mary approach that was somewhat similar to what Park Geun-hye tried before her plans collapsed. And that her plan was NAPSI, the Northeast Asia Peace and Cooperation Initiative, where South Korea would have this idea that everyone would sign up to. It was the end of her effort, her final effort, and it failed miserably. Well, Moon's effort was an end of the war declaration, where the more limited in the countries that would agree to it, but it would be transformative, he thought. But he was too isolated. There was no one really interested in giving him what he wanted. And so that period is the last gasp. And now you turn, beginning as early as late 2019, but certainly in 2020, to the realization of what South Korea must deal with in terms of a regional environment. It had changed dramatically. South Korea had been belated in its awakening to what was going on. And even Jae-in tried to stem it, to sort of keep it at bay for a while, but it was very hard to do. So it was, it's not that Yoon began this transformation, he accelerated it. He recognized it more fully and moved to embrace it by tilting more substantially toward the United States. But he really had no alternative because all of the other countries were moving in directions that gave him no leeway. Moon was reluctant but dragged along. China and Russia rejected his efforts even at the end. Trump ignored him at the end. Biden pursued him, and he gave some ground. And then Yoon really joined the regional consensus. The Ukraine war became a catalyst, a huge catalyst. There's still some gap. Japan and South Korea aren't totally on the same wavelength and supporting the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework and other aspects of the overall strategy that's emerged. But there is extraordinary transformation underway. The forces of polarization proved overwhelming. The regional realities overwhelmed triangularity, which was the hope for about 20 years of Russia, South Korea, and even Japan to take advantage of some degree of flexibility, and all of them moved away from that. So I would just summarize, South Korea stood at the sort of the fulcrum of regional dynamism, envisions itself as the key to regional transformation, kind of swing state. And it went through 3 transitions. I would regard 2022 as the third transition, even further beyond what it had already been taking. And it ended up where one could have predicted it would, based on the regional dynamics underway. I'll stop there.
So I wrote my 3 chapters on South Korea's North Korea policy during these 3 periods that I already mentioned. Park Geun-hye's trust politic approach in 2013 to 2015, and then the period between 2016 to 2019 as Park Geun-hye's tenure ends and the Moon administration comes in, and then the start of the administration starting 2022. So if I'm just going to quickly summarize these periods, the first period under Park Geun-hye, and I titled this chapter, Trust Politic Approach to Denuclearization and Unification. Remember the unification period. This was the period when President Park Geun-hye launched this so-called trust politic policy. I remember this her Foreign Affairs article to really diffuse tensions with North Korea while also adding unification as a tangible short-term goal. You might remember the jackpot and bonanza and a whole bit. When Park Geun-hye came to the office, it was 2013, her initial focus was building trust. That was a big thing, right? This so-called alignment policy. And that's, what is that? It's like, it's both strengthening deterrence and staying steady against Pyongyang's, provocation while still reiterating that South Korea is open to dialogue. And this trust politic as a concept at least had a public support initially because public saw Park Geun-hye's this approach. This seemed somehow realistic. It seemed a little bit more balanced, something that represents a midway between what seemed to be sort of an unreciprocated generosity, let's say, of Kim Dae-jung, Roh Moo-hyun, sunshine policy era, and then sort of the subsequent more hardline, well, the Lee Myung-bak policy, right, previous. So it's kind of, they thought this is a two-part approach, seemed a little bit realistic. And then this approach also involved military exercises with the United States and South Korea's own missile test, while also stressing this, the need for the Koreans to really tear down the barriers to unification. And then, as Gil mentioned, there was a huge China component based, even in her North Korea policy, had a big China component based on the premise that the road to Pyongyang really went through Beijing, right? So you may remember when she visited China or Beijing in June of 2013, which was her second trip, overseas trip following Washington. And her decision to travel to China before she went to Japan, that really broke precedent, and that was sort of a big deal at the time. And the subsequent meeting between Xi Jinping and Park Geun-hye was seen as a really high point in Korea-China bilateral relationship, right? Because they had a personal rapport. She even gave this big public speech in Mandarin. Media gushed about it, calling it again, Gil, as you said, like unprecedented honeymoon period for China and South Korea. But China's attitude at the time really largely stemmed from their own frustration with Pyongyang. It was not really an indicative of a larger shift in North Korea policy. So, of course, Kim Jong-un regime predictably responded to Park Geun-hye's policies with acrimony, accusations, and threats. And despite numerous meetings between Xi Jinping and Park Geun-hye, ultimately, Park's efforts to gain alignment on North Korea policy with China was unsuccessful. And then Park Geun-hye pivots to this whole adding Korean unification as a central tenet of her North Korea policy. The second chapter, which I called it Great Hopes and Shattered Dreams, and this chapter covers, again, the very dramatic years of 2016 to 2019, right? Both period of great tensions and high hopes for the Korean Peninsula. Again, representing very high point in South Korean expectations that diplomacy and symmetry with North Korea could succeed. So the year 2016 is when Park Geun-hye was forced to alter her North Korea policy by having to adopt tougher measures. Remember, deploying THAAD, missile defense system, closing down the Kaesong industrial complex. And 2017, President Moon Jae-in, after Park Geun-hye was ousted, refocuses Seoul's policy on luring North Korea back into talks. So, and Moon champions this policy of engagement and rapprochement, even as North Korea 2017 famously crosses the twin thresholds of developing thermonuclear weapons and flight testing ICBM. This is, remember, the year of fire and fury. So in 2018, we have President Moon making a bold bet on both Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump, which appear to put Seoul in the driver's seat in the spirit of diplomacy, yet this optimism reflects, in a way, a misreading of both Kim Jong-un and Trump. And so even as the Moon administration saw the greatest decline of tensions on the Korean Peninsula since the end of the Korean War, after the failure of the Hanoi summit in February 2019, we have Moon Jae-in that's left isolated. He's scorned by Kim Jong-un, who blamed him for the collapse of the talks. It was seen skeptically by the Trump administration. And, so South Korean expectations and diplomacy with North Korea, that diplomacy could succeed with North Korea, that hope was brutally dashed. So Hanoi summit really spelled the end of President Moon's and the Moon administration's illusion that Seoul was in the driver's seat. So then Kim Jong-un turns to China and Russia. And then the third chapter that I in the book, I title it South Korea Confronts the New Missile Age. And this chapter really covers 2020 to 2022. And it's really a watershed period because ever since the Sunshine Policy era, Seoul has envisioned some sort of breakthrough with Pyongyang and there could be a breakthrough with Pyongyang, and that's capable of wrenching down tensions. And this was obviously with the progressive administrations. But by 2020, as I just mentioned, these hopes were completely on our life support, breakdown in diplomacy. And then by 2022, if you remember, this is now a completely hopeless situation. We have record number of North Korean missile tests, some 100 tests in 2022. We have North Korea declaring a new nuclear doctrine, talking about preemptive strike and lowering the threshold for nuclear use. We have a deteriorating global environment with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, growing U.S.-China tensions, which again further splits the international community and really makes it impossible for the great powers to come together to deal with North Korea. And that leaves basically Biden and President Yoon talking about bolstering extended deterrence, and then talking to Prime Minister Kishida about improving tripartite cooperation with U.S., China, U.S., South Korea, and Japan. I'll just conclude with the following, what does all this mean? What's some of the key takeaway with South Korea's North Korea policy in the past decade? And, I would say first, obviously North Korea poses to be most intractable national security challenge for South Korea. Every South Korean president, leader, and these three leaders try to reduce the danger. But clearly they don't have any successes to show for their efforts. But there's no alternative but to keep trying. So we again have Park Geun-hye, who comes in with high hopes and trying to have more balanced policy, but ultimately very little to show for her foray into trust politics. We have President Moon Jae-in, who champions policy of engagement and rapprochement with the North, even very dramatic shift to symmetry and diplomacy, but Moon's gamble on Trump and Kim also does not lead to, denuclearization. And then now we have President Yoon. President Yoon, when Moon saw himself as some sort of a peacemaker, but President Yoon really zeroed in on strengthening military alliance with the United States, building up missile programs, again, a lot of focus on extended deterrence. But again, what we have is a period of missile development, and that's growing at an unprecedented rate right now, an international environment that is still favorable for North Korea, in that China and Russia they're not doing anything to help and cooperate with the United States and allies. So the bottom line, which is very depressing, I don't mean to depress, but it is a North Korea policy. What can I do, right? Like I trace it. There's a Korean leaders going back to, they all try to do a variety of different things. And it's really, when you review it, it's remarkable how much what they try to do and why to deal with the North Korean issue. But neither the sunshine policy, neither the trust politics, nor maximum engagement have succeeded in ending North Korea's nuclear missile program. So we are where we are now. By the time our chapters end, in terms of North Korea had become really one of the three countries in the world, along with China and Russia, that's capable of hitting U.S. mainland with nuclear-tipped ICBMs. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. So in my chapters, I trace domestic politics and partisan narratives. And to do that, what I did was gather sources from editorials of partisan newspapers. So that included Joseon, Donga, and Jungang for conservative narratives, and Hangare and Gyeongyang for progressive narratives. The goal here really was to try and find meaningful continuities and changes in these partisan narratives, and trace the processes of both convergence and divergence in their coverages of specific events that were happening in the region. So in the first period, in terms of domestic politics and partisan narratives, what was really surprising about this was a surprising agreement on China. Right? With Park Geun-hye's trust politics, the conservative narrative about regional order and inter-Korean cooperation was starting to show elements of a balancing approach that had long been sort of championed by the progressives until this point. So even though the coverages of about North Korea continue to feature long-standing themes like prospects of regime collapse, it also raised questions about China's role in inter-Korean relations. You'll remember Jang Song-taek's execution in 2013 and the kind of debates that this raised for China's relations with North Korea. So in hindsight, this may all seem a little bit tenuous, but at the time it raised real questions about the potential for strategic realignment in the region, and that you can really see in these partisan coverages. Thinking about, Park's visit to Beijing in 2015, attendance at the victory parade next to Putin and Xi Jinping, there seemed to be at least a symbolic movement in this bilateral relations. And that was also bolstered by the undercurrent of tensions with the United States, as well as continued controversies over Japanese colonial legacies, which Park had stood a very firm ground until the 2016. Of course, a lot of this would unravel with North Korea's fourth nuclear test, but there was really real optimism and sort of partisan convergence in terms of the potential for using China as a lever for inter-Korean relations. On the second period, this period really was the wild ride, right? Park's foreign policy reversals in the wake of North Korea's nuclear tests, it was also timed with significant domestic scandals that would later culminate in her impeachment. And the start of Moon's tenure also meant a series of reversals after that. So this was a period where the usual dynamics of partisan narrative politicking didn't apply because the conservative voices, especially those tied to the Park government, had lost so much legitimacy in the eyes of public opinion and discourse. You'll also remember that this Park's departure was timed with Donald Trump's election in the United States. And so partisan narratives here really reflected the volatility of the times. For instance, this was the first time when some in the Conservative Party were very sort of vocally calling for self-nuclearization, seeing US nuclear deterrence as no longer reliable. Of course, we're seeing some echoes of that today as well. So on the one hand, you saw the return of the progressive narrative in its fullest form, especially as Moon Jae-in took the leadership with the candlelight support. This meant casting all these prior foreign policy decisions by the Park administration as lacking procedural legitimacy and sort of authoritarian, right? This was a way to kind of chart the domestic pathways to reverse a lot of what she had done in the foreign policy arena. The last period, I think, is when you begin to see some of the traditional rifts in partisan narratives reappear. With Moon Jae-in's diplomatic failures, there was growing resonance with the narrative of strategic clarity that was being championed by the conservatives, based on a rehabilitated alliance with the United States and partnership with Japan. But I think partisan narratives also reflected some hangover from the days of Donald Trump and the erratic policies in the region, and especially his very transactional approach to working with South Korea that left many in both parties questioning US credibility. So domestic discourses in South Korea often refer to domestic discourses in the United States, and the framing around America before allies as to think about how can we best protect our own interests along with, but also apart from those of the United States. Still, I think domestic political dynamics favor the conservative narrative in two ways. The first is that most of the South Koreans came to blame China for the emergence of COVID-19 pandemic and the subsequent global economic chaos. So anti-Chinese sentiments began to ring really high, and this meant that South Koreans were less likely to punish Seoul for crossing Beijing's lines. And the second was that the public saw very little prospect for de-escalation in the US-China relations. One Asan survey showed that more than half the respondents saw this rivalry as hegemonic, which meant that most South Koreans were coming to see this competition as really zero-sum. And that gave greater credence to the sort of conservative narrative that this was time for strategic clarity, which we continue to see today. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Eun A. Looking at the clock. We want to open things up to the audience, both in person and online, for questions. But Reading the book and also listening to you summarize your chapters, I have a question. I'm formulating the thought as I ask the question, so excuse me. But Gil, you, in each of your chapters references this, but the book, it talks about this period of time, this decade, is this sort of window between the end of the Cold War and the start of the new Cold War, so-called new Cold War, where this sort of aperture opens either in the perceptions of South Koreans across administrations, where they have more agency than they've ever had to help transform the region. And we see continuities, again, and your chapters point this out, across conservative and progressive administrations when it comes to the relationship with China and this idea of playing some sort of semi-autonomous balancing role. Of course, it takes on different orientations under different administrations, but also, and Sumi, you cover this, having a sort of proactive role in fostering some sort of breakthrough with North Korea in this triangular relationship with the U.S. But as the account gets to its close, it's like this aperture, this window has closed. It's like what they believed that they had as agency, or even that they may have possessed, given shifting geopolitical conditions and the security environment, some sort of window is closed. But, and I think that that's accurate, but events will continue to transpire. And geopolitical conditions will continue to evolve, and maybe somewhat rapidly, depending on how elections go in all of these countries. Is it not possible that we will continue to see this? I don't know who wrote this, but this sort of flailing, back and forth, moving forward. So is this window not really closing, or does this make sense? What I'm sort of posing? Is it as final as you've said, or and maybe that's a mischaracterization of
You mean North Korea?
well, of all there's sort of a coming down to earth sort of sense at the end of this account that all these possibilities that they thought were possible really weren't possible, whether it was with North Korea or being a regional architect, that they've been sort of disabused of these ideas. But the idea of a global pivotal state, discussion about South Korea developing its own nuclear weapons. These conversations are still afoot. And of course, progressive opposition to trilateral tightening and the need to chart a more autonomous regional course are, of course, rife in South Korean domestic context. So
let me take the first shot at this. I think it's the big question. My view is that South Korea was supremely overconfident, much too much, and that they misjudged China repeatedly. That 2013 and 14, Xi Jinping was moving decisively in one direction, and South Korea was assuming he was moving in a different direction. And so I think there's a lot of hubris here. There's such a thirst for self-realization, for gaining leverage after so many decades in the Cold War, where Seoul was unable to express itself. It was just so dependent and so mired in regional, in hardline regional divisions, that suddenly there's this notion of diplomatic diversification. Seoul has a voice that really matters, and it's such an exaggeration, and it takes a long time for it to sink in. And given the realities right now, and I think the driving forces are really not within South Korea's control. Given the realities right now of where China's heading and what it wants, and how the U.S. is responding, and what Russia is doing with North Korea and so on, I don't see any flailing that's realistic ahead. I don't think these myths of what South Korea can do are going to be able to be revived, even if the U.S. has its own serious problems ahead.
So I agree with this, because if I'm narrowing my focus on North Korea, it's even more particularly so, right? So you can see different periods, like during this decade, look what North Korea was able to achieve in terms of like, it's what I would say, very aggressive advancement in both nuclear and increasingly diverse and mobile missile forces. And so, you have, North Korea has their own doctrine. They said that Kim Jong-un, how many times he need to repeatedly say that he's not going to denuclearize. He adopted a new law that expands the condition in which the North could use nuclear weapons, which includes non-nuclear attacks. And he's not going to get off this path. And I don't see what can get him off this path. And this is what I mean by external environment that's being favorable for North Korea because of this geopolitics with Russia and China. Look at last whole year. United Nations Security Council even couldn't come up with condemnation. They cannot get their act together. It's a complete impasse. And I don't see what's really, what would get Kim Jong-un off this path. Again, I think China and Russia is allowing Kim Jong-un to act with more agility, with impunity, and I don't see any kind of repercussions. Maybe the one wild card is U.S. in the United States. Maybe, if we have a different president next year that pursues a different policy. But even in that case, I'm not, I don't think it's going to be necessarily South Korea that's going to be able to, be the sort of the driver. Right. So again, so I agree with that. I think it's going to be very difficult in terms of North Korea policy. And again, Gil, you mentioned South Korea misjudging China, and I think South Korea also misjudged North Korea and the United States. So I don't have a optimistic picture that they're going to be able to really, particularly when it comes to North Korea policy.
I think I share the same pessimism when it comes to domestic politics.
We didn't coordinate this.
Partisan narratives are generally areas where you see more continuity than change. And one area where we might see this in the coming many years regards to trilateral cooperation under a possible progressive administration, right? Will we be able to overcome the kind of existing partisan narrative surrounding Japan in ways that make this cooperation more institutional and durable? I think that is still a question. I think beyond the narratives, certain continuities are just inevitable. We are a divided nation with contested sovereignty issues, allied with a great power who is locked in a competition with a regional power. So I think these structural impediments will just continue to remain. But I do see, at least in the kind of domestic narratives, there's greater optimism in the role that South Korea can play within these regional dynamics. And this may not be in terms of actually shaping the cost-benefit calculus for the United States or China, but in kind of crucial areas of global governance where we do need greater multilateralism, including climate policy or supply chain resilience. So there is more activism in these domains where I think South Korea is trying to chart its own territory as a pivotal power. But that optimism can also die out very quickly in these narratives, depending on kind of key things that South Korea does not have control over.
Can I just quickly ask you, do you think generational change will have an effect on some of these deep continuities and partisan divides?
I think so. I think because of the ways in which South Korean domestic politics has been sort of very generationally confined, I think that is maybe another reason why we see such continuities in these narratives. But it could be that when more younger people get involved in politics and there are sort of less baggages from historical events that might carry over, perhaps we will see greater differences in these narratives.
Although one thing I think should be mentioned is this: young people are not very interested in China. No. There's been this, and North Korea. So that generational change seems to be supportive of the changes Yoon is making.
I think that is the big question is about unification, right? I continue to look over public support, particularly along generation lines on support for unification. And what you see is even though people continue to report significantly high national benefits of unification, when it comes to reporting their personal stakes in it, it is significantly low. And this becomes in the kind of teens for the current younger generation. So what does that mean for the kind of each administration's thinking around unification, which kind of has been in a policy stasis for so long, especially with the younger generation being so disinterested in this program? I think that will be very interesting going forward.
Okay, let's open it up to the audience. If you do have a question, please raise your hand and we will bring a microphone to you. Same right here and then here. And if you're watching online, please add a question into the chat box and we can turn to that.
Robert Sharetta with International Investor. We detect another divide. I wonder if you'd comment on in Korean society. We talk to a lot of business executives, board directors, entrepreneurs. When we ask them where their future is economically, it's China, not the West. They're already the biggest trading partner. And I wonder if you detect the same.
You mean from South Korea?
Yes.
Their public opinion towards China is pretty negative, even though they've been it's very negative, in fact. It's turned much more negative in 2016 and again in 2019, 2020. And so there's hesitance to sign up for the full implications of the effort to use economic security as a factor that will limit economic relations. There's some resistance because the economic cost is pretty painful to go forward. But I think in general that the trust of China is pretty low. And even in business circles, from what I've read, there's more worry about China as a competitor and China treating South Koreans unfairly than there was just a few years ago.
I would just say that what you're saying is, I mean, of course, China is such an important country for South Korea, largest trading partner. And the trade volume is double, used to be double that of South Korea, US, South Korea, Japan combined, and all of that. But I think the pivotal turning point really was over this THAAD deployment and, whole economic coercion and China basically sanctioning South Korea. A lot has happened in recent years where that the trend is very, very negative. And it's not just young people. And it's not just about, economic coercion. It's about cultural encroachment. It's about, what was that soap opera that was completely shut down because it used Chinese, cultural things. It's on air pollution. It's at every level, at every angle. And when you compare it, and it's not just low, it's one of, I think, the lowest internationally.
That's right, that
of the
Pew
view of
Research
China.
poll, highest negative.
Highest negative. And when you compare it to, say, Japan, when China beats Japan, and Japan is actually trending up in the sense of, at least with the younger generation, have a particular different perspective. So I think when you look at it as a trend, I think that it's a downward trajectory in terms of South Korea and China.
Yeah, that said, I think there is great general public opposition, but I would also not be entirely sure whether they would support any policy that would substantially harm South Korea's economic standing. So while public distrust means that there are greater leeway for each administration to pursue different forms of de-risking, I think this will also depend on the specific contours of the policy and how the administration can justify it to the South Korean public.
Yeah, I think that's right. Just the Pew Research poll that a lot of people reference shows these very high negative sentiments, but it also shows a sentiment that the relationship with China is critical and will be increasingly so in coming years. And that, undermining that in our economic relationship in the name of human rights is something that South Koreans would not be favorable to. So there are contradictory sort of trends at work. Robert?
I'm Peter Humphrey, an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. Dr. Cho, you mentioned how thin the U.S. Nuclear umbrella is, and I assessed it's even thinner, that unless there was a direct North Korean attack on Sasebo or Yokosuka or Guam or the United States itself, there is zero chance we would flatten Pyongyang or Wonsan or anyone else. And so South Koreans reflecting on this have got to be viewing development of their own nuclear capability as ever more desirable. And with the exception of a few components like beryllium tampers and a few other things, no one doubts that ultimately South Korea could get a nuclear weapon. The question is, how much will the U.S. Fight back against that development? Would we go whole hog and tell the South Koreans, you go down that path, we're withdrawing all our assets, and even our conventional military umbrella will no longer be available to you? Would we go that far?
Well, that's a difficult question. And you're right, there is huge public support for indigenous nuclear development. At some point, it reached 70% of a representative survey. So that shows that there are, that if in the kind of second period where I was detecting these narratives, more fringe conservative narratives about nuclear weapons, this is now very much mainstream. But I also think it's interesting because recent research also shows that US credibility remains very high in South Korea. So the public support for nuclear weapons that hasn't aligned with expectations of declined US credibility in the way that conservative narrative had earlier packaged. So this may mean, too, that there are some other considerations, like South Korea's pursuit of status, that is playing into this ambition for nuclear weapons. As for what the United States will do in the event that this became an actual policy line of any incumbent administration, I cannot say. But what I am seeing, though, is that this is no longer a mainstream no longer a non-mainstream discussion, right? People are talking about it, and I'm sure when the Yoon administration made the redeployment of tactical nuclear weapons as his kind of policy line, that there was some negotiation behind that as well. Perhaps you can speak more to this.
No, so absolutely, it's true, like what the public is supporting, and even after the Washington Declaration, it's like it's okay for now. It's definitely an upgrade, but it's not definitive, right? It's still, a lot needs to be figured out with Washington Declaration. But again, remember, like what I talked about, it's the trajectory. We cannot get North Korea off this path that it's on. We can do deterrence, we can do trilateral strengthening with Japan and Korea, and all of that, and we will, missile defense and exercises and so on. But Kim Jong-un is not going to get off this path. So he's going to continue on in perfecting nuclear weapons. So if the South Koreans are here, we can only go towards this direction even further. And, I just spent time with the South Korean officials. Everybody also talk about next year's election here. Right? I mean, like we cannot not talk about it. It's because they are stressed about it because of the whole, President Trump returns in terms of his previous talk about withdrawing U.S. forces from South Korea and all of this talk. There's an even greater anxiety. So it's what you said. Plus, I think you were only go in that direction. It depends on how it goes. And in terms of U.S. policy, it also depends on the administration. Right now, this particular administration is against it, understandably so, while understanding where South Korean public is coming from. They're still against it for non-proliferation. We care about non-proliferation regime, but that could also change. So I think that's sort of the future. It really depends. If there's anything to say.
Gil, did you? Speaking of elections, I think we have a question about that online. Sang?
So the online question is asking about the National Assembly election in South Korea next year. So if you can comment on the forecast and also how that would affect President Yoon's foreign policy.
Well, I mean, I don't know if you want to comment, but I think obviously, it really depends on if for the conservative, for this administration, if the election does not go well from the Yoon administration's perspective, it does hamper, you become a more of a lame duck. That said, right now, it's not like, the National Assembly majority is like, there's a lot of division, yet President Yoon was able to achieve certain things, like improving relationship with Japan, repairing ties, and he did that, at great cost, right? This was not necessarily a popular decision. He had to really, so it's I don't know if it's going to change that much in terms of, what some of the core things that President Yoon is pursuing. I understand he's a pretty stubborn guy. He have done some things that's the public doesn't necessarily support. So it really depends on how badly he loses the election from the administration's perspective. But I think some of the core things that he's pursuing, I think will still stay.
Yeah, I think I share the same perspective. This works in two ways, right? On the one hand, just by the sheer virtue of the way the institutions have been set up, South Korean presidents have such great leeway in foreign policy making. So it is only in situations where greater public sentiments can be mobilized for partisan politicking, where something like this would have sort of a reversing effect on the foreign policy path that the administration wants to set. So I think the constraining effects of both domestic party alignments and also public sentiment is going to be situational most of the time.
Guy?
Guy Aragoni, former Intel analyst, presently a Ronin. I want to drill down a little more on what was just said. One of the interesting things to me from 2013 to now is South Korea and Japan. Park came in with a very strong Japan connections, tried to move forward in that area, and had to back away very quickly from a trilateral. Yoon has been able to move forward in it without us, with it not being obvious why he's been more successful. And I wonder if you could comment again a little more detail on how he was able to move forward and President Park was not.
Let me take a shot at that. I think of this as a triangle, and that South Korea is wary of the United States and Japan becoming very close, and South Korea having a difficult relationship with the U.S. There's a sort of competition between Japan and South Korea, and a fear of being isolated in a U.S. regional strategy where Japan is wholeheartedly with the U.S. and the U.S. is strongly supporting Japan. And I think that's been a factor over these years. In 2015, I think that was a factor in Park understanding that her policy was in danger. Her overall policy was in danger unless she improved relations and made a deal on the comfort women. And I see today that although domestic issues in South Korea are complicating, that the U.S.-Japan relationship is extremely close, and South Korea has sort of signed on to it, become the third party to it. And that has made things a lot easier. It would be very complicated if after any political change in South Korea, they started going after Japan again. It would create a great deal of trouble in the United States, I'm sure.
Agree, but let's not also take away, from the leadership angle, right? Kim Dae-jung was able to do that. It does take certain courage and certain leaders to push that agenda. And President Yoon, even when he was campaigning, said he's going to make this into a priority, and he did that. So I'm just saying, it's also Kishida, it's also Yoon, it's also Biden, and these. So now I do believe there's a window of opportunity. So I gave you a very negative picture of North Korea, which is all true. But I think if there's one silver lining, that we do have a very small window, and I don't know how long this is going to last because of various politics and elections and so on, but we do have a very small window of opportunity to really strengthen trilateral relationship. And we, with communication, data transfer, intel sharing, missile defense cooperation, being able to be able to integrate sensors. There are so many things that we can do that we need to get to it with a sense of urgency because we don't know when this is going to come to an end.
Yeah, I also think there are kind of two specific things that help President Yoon. The first is that it comes at a very particular moment when U.S.-China competition has sort of reached this threshold of hostility, and South Korean domestic sentiments, most importantly, have turned so strongly against China. But I think another thing is that it is also very early in Yoon's tenure that he was able to push this agenda. We might remember President Lee Myung-bak's agenda on Japan, right? And how long he had managed to make progress on relations with Japan, but also how quickly he turned against Japan during his lame duck years. Because the truth is, anti-Japanese narratives have just long been kind of a go-to way to recover domestic legitimacy for many South Korean presidents. So think about, how the agreement over GSOMIA collapsed at the 11th hour, and how President Lee Myung-bak then orchestrated this surprise visit to Dokdo and was, calling for sovereignty over this island. So things can change, but I think it is the combination of how early President Yoon is in his tenure and the kind of specific, the structural environment that allowed him to push for this agenda in a fairly decisive way.
Well, so much to discuss, never enough time. I know I could see other hands in the crowd, but we want to stick to our allotted event time, unfortunately. But the authors are here, so make a mad dash to the stage afterwards. Thank you again, Eun A, Sumi, and Gil for not only the fantastic contribution, but coming to discuss it as well. And I'll just close by saying, as I had mentioned, Gil is peer review editor for our journal Korea Policy. We have copies in the foyer, and the third issue of this year, its inaugural year, will come out before the close of the year, and it's focused on the concept of economic security and from different countries' perspectives. And it's really getting ahead of what is obviously a very intense and sort of commonplace discussion these days. So we had some very good in-depth analysis of different national perspectives on the concept of economic security. So stay tuned for that. Thank you, everyone, for coming.